We are definitely on a path towards full-on state repression. There's no question about it.
But I guess what you're saying is that we really need to look under the slab at what's happening to government, to institutions, to independent minds in the United States right now.
It's a revolution, it's a coup, you can call it what you want. It's pretty obvious that this is a hostile takeover using the electoral system of the US government.
Do you think there is a danger that all these things could actually lead to a proper shooting war?
We're already in a situation where you could describe this as World War III.
When do people wake up to the fact that this is a disaster for this country? Welcome to the Fourcast, this time from Washington, D.C., as America and China go to war. Not a real war, not yet anyway, but a trade war, which is pretty significant when it involves the two biggest economies on the planet. Now, the market turmoil of the last week, which has had a bit of a reprieve because the tariff deadline has been delayed by 90 days on most tariffs, has raised some really serious questions. Can Donald Trump tell the difference between friend and foe? Can America still be trusted? Is there a cunning plan to all the stuff that he seems to be making up on a daily basis? Now, these are really important questions because it's only, not even 100 days into the Trump presidency, and we've got at least another 3.5 years to go of this. So where does this all end up? Someone who knows Trump well, because she worked with him, and worked for other presidents as well, by the way, is Fiona Hill, a Russia expert, a foreign policy expert, someone that Trump hasn't always been very kind about, but we're being very kind to her today because she's here with us in Washington. Fiona, what did he or his people call you? Just remind us.
Well, according to what I heard, I was apparently termed the Russia bitch.
The Russia bitch?
Yes.
With a nice accent, I think.
Suppose. Well, a bit later he called me a deep state stiff with a nice accent.
A deep state stiff with a nice accent.
Yes, right. Exactly. In a very formal statement. But the other, I guess, moniker was thrown about behind the scenes at various points.
And that's because you testified against him in the Russia impeachment trials of was it 2019, I think. And then, of course, you had your security clearance scrapped. But in fact, the truth about that is that you never asked for it to be renewed. Is that right?
Yeah, there's always more than meets the eye to many of these performative gestures. But of course, you have to take them seriously because you're in the crosshairs, and that's a shot across the bows. I mean,
do you feel you're in the crosshairs?
Well, everybody who has crossed in one way or another is absolutely in the crosshairs. That's why they're called crosshairs, I guess, in many respects. So, yes, of course. But in the case of my security clearance, it always lapses after a certain period of time after you leave public office and after you've had your full clearance done. And I'd never renewed it. So for me, it was something of as I said, a performative symbolic gesture. You know, it gets attention of everybody else, but it wasn't really materially consequential, but it has been for, a number of other people.
I mean, the big story this week, obviously, are the markets. Every week, we're kind of asking ourselves the same questions. Is he reliable? Is there a plan? Can you tell the difference between friend and foe?
In terms of friend and foe, it's not about America or the United States. It's about Trump himself. And Trump has friends who are loyal to him. He has friends who are people who he's worked with for a long time or people that he admires. He often styles all kinds of people like Vladimir Putin and many other world leaders friends because he sees them as peers. And although the people that he admires, for the things that they've done or the stature that they have in the world. But in terms of allies, partners, in the conventional geopolitical sense, no, there's no difference between friend or foe. They're all adversaries, and they're all basically interlocutors who have to be shown their place. So, no, I mean, there is no distinguishing feature between the traditional allies and friends of the United States and its enemies when it comes to many of the things that Trump is doing.
So it's not that he can't tell the difference, he's just not interested in telling the difference because it's all about him.
Well, it's about him, and he can tell the difference between his own friends and those people who are not his friends, getting back to how you started the discussion. But it's not about America, it's not about US national interests. So we have to just accept this right from the beginning, and then you have to assess things in a very different way.
When you look at the way that he's handled the markets and the tariffs in the last week, are there parallels to the way that he handled foreign policies when you were working for him?
Yes, I mean, he likes to come out swinging many times, but if he gets some kind of really significant pushback, he often then tacks onto a different course. We saw that over and over again in the first term, and we're really seeing it very vividly. Everyone's seeing it right now. Now, what's interesting, of course, is based on what had happened previously, all kinds of people, including the markets and American billionaires and other investors, basically came to the conclusion that Trump's bark was a lot worse than his bite. They weren't really properly analysing what had happened in the first term, where he was much more constrained. Now he's absolutely unconstrained. And the stock market, which was seen to be a reliable predictor of the kind of actions he would take, because he was always emphasising the importance of the increase in stock prices, and the thought was that if it plunged, certainly took the kind of nosedive that it did immediately after tariffs, that he would immediately change course. Well, it turns out that this time, he was so determined to press ahead. The stock market was not an indicator, but it turned out the bond market became an indicator, because suddenly everybody around him was warning of his, to use, kind of British comparison, inevitable Liz Truss moment, where all faith in the British economy disappeared because of basically so many switches and twists and turns and uncertainty and, frankly, assessed ineptitude in the handling of the economy.
So that feeling that trust is seeping away from America, that trust is bleeding out, which is the kind of what the bond markets indicate, that's pretty scary, isn't it? I mean, if you're someone who's worked in the administration, you live in Washington, D.C., you've lived in this country for decades, to watch that happening is a scary moment.
Well, it's pretty sobering. I think anybody who hadn't really been paying attention the first time around may be more scared because they don't know what's happening. But if you've been well prepared and you've analysed the situation, it's more, of course, this is of great concern and how we're going to deal with it. But, you get scared and frightened when you haven't properly assessed what's happening. Now, there are some things that I personally hadn't anticipated. I hadn't anticipated the emergence of Elon Musk with a literal chainsaw to attack the federal government and many, distinguished institutions. I'd expected that Trump would go after higher education, because that was already a kind of a pattern that had been set. Any independent entity, he would go after in some way. But I didn't expect that they would go to the extent of literally trying to kind of cut off all of the sources of US wealth and prosperity, because I thought someone somewhere, including in the people who've joined forces with him, the various billionaires who, purportedly made their billions by being very savvy investors and assessors of the US economy, might be able to exert some influence. But knowing what I know from the first term, I know it's extraordinarily hard to exert influence. There's only a handful of people I think were really very effective, and the particular group of people around him seemed to be much less effective than those previously who had some success.
Because when you worked for him in the first term, there were real expertise, the so-called, designated adults in the room, who were the guardrails. And all the people who've been appointed now seem to be there because either they're mates or they're slavishly loyal to him.
Oh, they've also got the same worldview, frankly. I would actually single out, prior to all of this, some of the people who worked on the economic side of things, which is why I think people didn't assess things accurately. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin,
in the first administration,
the trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, you've mentioned Gary Cohn and all of the team around them. They were really consummate professionals. They understood what Trump was trying to do, but they also were able to shape what he did. And in part, I think, somebody like Secretary Mnuchin, he was very distinguished at Goldman Sachs. He treated Trump like a high net worth individual, troublesome client. And he was extraordinarily smooth. I witnessed it many times in the way that he managed him. Gary Cohn and others, these are really unsung heroes in many respects. At the first time around, they saved this kind of meltdown of the global economy. Now they've gone. And the people who have come in, we don't hear much from them at all.
Why don't they say anything now?
Well, I think probably because they're either trying, I suppose, in the case of Robert Lighthizer, still to have some kind of influence because people in his team, his previous team, are in this new administration, or they also don't want to draw attention to themselves. Maybe they're working, behind the scenes somewhere, to basically also get in the crosshairs. Because anybody who criticizes Trump has to be removed, has to be dominated, has to be humiliated, has to be pushed away, or in some extreme circumstances persecuted.
You know Russia really well. What you've just described, what you and your, fellow members of the administration, the first administration, are experiencing, sounds a little bit like the kind of stuff that Putin's up to, without pushing people out of windows or making them fall into gaps on the tube.
We are definitely on a path towards full-on state repression. There's no question about it.
You really think that?
Of course. I've thought this for an extraordinarily long time. This is why I was so outspoken before the election, including in conversations with you, and why so many other people were as well. I mean, there are many academics across the United States who have pointed out about the slippery slope to authoritarianism and autocracy that we're headed towards, making comparisons with other illiberal settings like Hungary and Turkey, for example. There's a whole host of articles being written now about competitive authoritarianism, but there's also a heck of a lot of people in this country who've experienced that directly, including, naturalized citizens, green card holders, who are now finding themselves also being persecuted, and many people who've and sought refuge in the United States who now find themselves being caught up in dragnets in immigration and summarily dispatched to El Salvador and all kinds of jails, or frankly deported. So look, there are a lot of people who can see what's happening here. And in terms of just basic history, you yourself, have origins in Germany, and many people are making, the comparisons with what happened in the 1930s and that slide away from what had been a pretty vibrant, society where people thought this can't happen here. And even the Chinese have started talking about a cultural revolution that's happening in the United States, not dissimilar from 1968 and the purges that the Chinese themselves undertook, in that kind of Maoist excess. So look, everybody is seeing what's happening here. It's just Americans themselves, I think, can't quite believe it.
Is there anything left to America's moral high ground?
There's a lot left, but it's really a kind of a question about how people comport themselves, whether they have the courage, to keep taking a stand. I would say courage is contagious, not just fear, and it really requires some collective action. I'm very worried about the steps that some law firms have taken, because that's really going to deprive many of the people who are going to really require now some pro bono support from perhaps getting
These are the law firms who won't be representing clients because they're afraid that if they do that, they're going to get clobbered by the Trump
administration. And these are many law firms that actually did before to step up when they thought it was safer to do so. And look, it also depends on how all these billionaires who've decided to support Trump decide where their bottom line is. Many of them are acting in their own self-interest and not in the interest of the United States. I have to really question how much they're being patriotic towards the United States. People are always invoking the name of the American people. Well, this government is not representative of the entirety of the American people. Most governments aren't. But they're supposed to be representing America writ large, and that's clearly not the case. And you're really going to have now collective action of others to take a stand to push back against this. And frankly, it's the same for foreign countries that are basically interacting with the United States. We've seen Canada be very firm, for example. And the so-called allies and friends, have to then act like friends. If this was another country what people were concerned about, if this was Germany, if this was France, if this was Italy, places where there has been concern, the United States would have spoken out in the past. It's time, I think, for that kind of speaking out and you're basically saying what is happening here.
But I guess what you're saying is that we really need to look under the slab at what's happening to government, to institutions, to independent minds in the United States right now, because this is also a revolution. And what's at stake this time is the future of the Republic. Yes,
look, it's a revolution, it's a coup, you can call it what you want. It's pretty obvious that this is a hostile takeover using the electoral system of the US government, which has happened in so many different countries. I mean, many countries that we would have once said were bastions of economic development or kind of political certitude and all kinds of historic and other geographical settings have gone down this path. The whole idea of the United States on as a shining city on the hill, as a great beacon of democracy and freedom, after World War II, it has tended to get people thinking, well, that couldn't possibly happen here. Well, yes, it could, and it is happening here, and people have to recognise that.
You left the UK, and you wrote about it in your book, There's Nothing for You Here, Love? What was the title of the book?
Well, there's nothing for you here, but my father had said this to me in 1984. He said, there's nothing for you here, pet.
Pet, from Northern England. Pet love, there's nothing for you. But there was something for you here in the US. You made your career here, first university, then you brilliantly worked with various administrations, then you wrote this book about it. And of course, your expertise is kind of comparing, autocratic regimes around the world, especially Russia. How much does it hurt you personally that you made your life here? You planted your flag here, and yet this stuff is happening to this country when you were looking at it elsewhere.
It's interesting because I don't actually take this personally because, having gone through things that I did early in my life when, every industry in my home region closed down, I couldn't really take that personally, although it personally affected me. This is will have and is having personal effects. But it's just so dispiriting, I think, in that kind of larger sense, but also alarming in the sense that I want to actually pull an alarm and say to people, look what's happening, that is happening here. Because in the first term, and I do actually have some questions, did we kind of enable other people in the sense of having, some kind of sense of complacency about Trump? Because many people look back and to the first term think, well, it wasn't that bad, was it? Well, it was actually pretty horrific behind the scenes. There was all kinds of things happening that wasn't normal in an American sense.
Give me a good example.
Well, there is the whole issue in foreign policy as well, where all kinds of strange, right-wing influencers were involved in setting foreign policy. Now, all kinds of influential people from all kinds of persuasions get involved with fringe views in any government. We see that, in the UK and any other setting that we want to pick. People always have advisors and friends who give them advice. But it basically resulted in a whole host of chaos and all kinds of chaotic actions then as well. But they were concealed behind a kind of facade of normalcy. You have all the stories of Gary Cohn and others, making interventions, literally taking things off the Resolute desk, so that Trump wouldn't act on them. I mean, people have now come out and talked about all of this. But the point is that this wasn't well known to the American public writ large. I and many others went across the country trying to talk to people, but ultimately what people saw, often it's what they want to see, was, somebody who was blunt and plain spoken in the case of Trump. He's charismatic, he's funny, he makes people feel good about themselves. And they came to the conclusion that things weren't that bad because they didn't see what was going on behind the curtain.
And what was it like behind the curtain? What was he like as a boss to you?
Well, I had very limited interactions with him. It was more in group settings. But, and I had limited interactions with him because he didn't take me very seriously. I mean, later on, he describes me as a deep state stiff with a nice accent. I get this Russia bitch moniker. It's that bitch who works on Russia, I presume, that they were kind of referring to me. So it just shows that they weren't taking me at all seriously. They didn't really care about it. But I saw him treating everybody else like that as well. Apart from the super loyalists who were very close to him. Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, one of the greatest and most important countries globally, not just in the United States. Secretary of State, dismissed as a secretary, just as kind of somebody who's part of the staff.
He wasn't very nice about him after
he left. He was terrible about him. You just named the number of people who passed through basically Trump's entourage, as he would think about it, but as his staff and his administration, and the way that they've been treated and continue to be treated, the things that he said about people, including to foreign leaders. I mean, the most things that were, I think, most... Again, I'm rarely shocked and surprised these days, but that at the time I found shocking was how easily he would dismiss people and how he would talk about them, the tone he would use, the descriptive factors about them behind their backs and in front of people like Vladimir Putin. He would say all the things that he says publicly to foreign leaders about fellow Americans. And no matter what you think about the politics, the partisan politics, you could expect the President of the United States to protect Americans, not just those who he thinks is loyal to him or have flattered him.
So again, looking at the events this week, what do you think he was really up to with these tariffs? I mean, was this about flexing his muscles? Was it a kind of soprano style of politics? What was it? I mean, no one can make sense even of the calculations of these tariffs.
Well, it's his calculation. So you have to be, him to figure out what the calculation was. I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward, honestly. I mean, he's said since the 1980s that he believes that tariffs are the solution. He still believes that. I mean, look, we all know people who will believe something irrespective of some of the evidence. They keep on going until they disprove it.
He blinked. He caved
because of the bond markets. Because in the end, I mean, he started. Remember though, what he said. It wasn't about him and a mistake. He said because people were getting yippee, or they were basically, getting panicked by it, and so he's pulling back, probably to pushing pause until he persuades people to go forward again. And he's certainly not restrained himself when it comes to China.
One extraordinary thing is the kind of attentional economy that he has pumped up. He loves ratings. He's obsessed with ratings. He wants to get the limelight all the time. And whether it's the markets or the Middle East or Russia, where's the follow-up? What has he actually achieved in the first 3 months of office? For all the bonanza and all the fireworks that came with
the whole world is obsessed with him, and it makes for great TV.
That's it.
Remember what he said in the Oval Office. Well, that's going to make for great TV, isn't it? And then he gave a little laugh.
Yeah.
He wants to be the most important person in the world. And if one thing doesn't get attention, he'll move on to the next thing. There are some things that he fundamentally wants and that he holds, as kind of deep-seated convictions. Tariffs is one of them. He honestly as well, look, we've got to, give some credit where it's due. He does want to generally stop the war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, his analysis of it may be off, but he wants to stop the slaughter.
Does he want the Nobel Peace Prize?
He does want the Nobel Peace Prize, but that's, kind of as a consequence of all the things that he wants to do. He wants to actually, head off Iran getting a nuclear weapon. He's talking about sitting down with Iran again. Same with North Korea. He actually does want to genuinely make the place safe, the world safe, against nuclear weapons. It is a good thing. It's just the whole way that he's going about everything. In fact, a trade war could inadvertently lead to all kinds of other consequences, as you said at the very beginning, to some kind of hot version of a war.
Do you think that's really possible with China?
Well, look, China is supporting Russia behind the scenes in its war in Ukraine. And Russia saw the war in Ukraine as a war against the United States, which Trump has recognised, and he's trying to pull the United States support away from Ukraine, but it's still a war against Ukraine. And in fact, it's a war against Europe, because for Russia, it's a war for the future of Europe and Russia's place in Europe at the expense of other European countries. Most especially against Ukraine, but also all of its neighbours, the Baltic states, Belarus, which has sort of disappeared into the Russian orbit, Poland, Finland, all of these countries see that. And as the US pulls away, that leaves Europe very uncomfortably juxtaposed against Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. And here's Trump trying to make his own deals with all of these, completely and utterly leaving the field that the United States entered 80 years ago. We're going to be celebrating VE Day shortly in May. That was the United States coming in as the guarantor of security in Europe. And now the United States looks more like the harbinger of insecurity in Europe rather than the guarantor of security. I mean, Trump is basically pulling out of Europe in the way that Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. I mean, you think about it in that way. I mean, this is a total reversal of a historic entry of the United States into Europe, and it's the lifetime of Trump. The man is almost 80. So his whole lifetime, his prosperity, his success has been based on the transatlantic relationship and the strength of that. And in a way, he's basically undermining his very self.
Why has he got it in for Europe so much, do you think?
He thinks that Europeans are vassals, parasites, basically ripping the United States off. He said it very clearly. And he's not wrong on the fact that, for 80 years, Europe shouldn't have been relying on the United States to basically underpin its security. He's not wrong at all.
His grandfather was from Germany. His mother came from Scotland. I mean,
well, again, so it's not personal in that regard. He sees this, again, as basically another rupture that he thinks is obviously not to the United States' benefit, which is when security and economics parted company again in the 1980s, which was the formulating period for the whole way that he thinks about things, which is when you get the rise of Japan, a formerly occupied country by America after World War II, and the rise of Europe. I mean, it takes a little bit of time, but that's when the EU starts to come into its own. And that's when other economies become less dependent on the United States, and they start producing their own products, and no one's running around with a Coca-Cola bottle in every hand, a Ford truck in every driveway, and the United States is having to compete more, and that's what he thinks is the big problem. He understands that China doesn't owe the United States anything, but he does believe that Japan and Europe owe the United States everything in terms of their prosperity.
And the reason why he and many others are freaked out by China is that China is beating America on one level at its own game.
Correct. And I mean, it's basically China, despite still being a communist country, at least nominally, is beating the United States at the game of capitalism.
But the irony in all this, again, just briefly getting back to tariffs and trade, I mean, does J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, do they really want Americans in, Wisconsin or Michigan make Nike trainers? And do the basic stuff that not even the Chinese are doing anymore. They've outsourced that to the Cambodians and the oceans.
Well, if you judge what J.D. Vance and others have said, yes, I suppose that they certainly do want that to happen.
But these aren't proper jobs for Americans.
Well, they're jobs. I think that's kind of what they would argue. And look, coming from Northern England, most of the jobs now that used to be in coal mines and steelworks in Amazon, super warehouses, they're in Nissan factories, there's a good job, in a factory.
Yeah.
But they're not the jobs that they used to be. My dad ended up being a hospital porter. He didn't like that job especially. And he sold a hanky bag, but it was a job.
Yeah.
And that was it. My dad wanted to work. And, if people want to work, they want a job. However, it is unlikely that Americans from Wisconsin and Michigan are going to move to, Arizona, California to work in fields and, in crops or in meat packing plants, for example. So there's, a flaw in some of this thinking here, that many of the jobs that immigrants, kind of fill now in the United States will be taken over by Americans because the population's in different places because of the larger, parts of the economy. Now, they do want to bring back car manufacturing back to Michigan and elsewhere, but we're more likely to see such a disruption of the auto manufacturing sector globally that it's unlikely again that will be a boom in the United States. So it's all of these externalities, all of this, the fact that the world is a lot more complicated place even than it was in the 1980s. The rise of, the digital sector, for example. I mean, people are already saying the knowledge economy. All of us who invested in, degrees is the next step, in my case, out of the mines. They encourage education to be part of the knowledge economy. That's all going to change as well.
Yeah.
So we're in a period of enormous change in the economic structures, in the world of technology, kind of great breakthroughs. And the United States was at the forefront of all of this. And this is why I think many of the things that they're doing with tariffs and other attacks on higher education, for example, they're really attacking the roots of research and development in the United States, that people don't see. The United States has been at the forefront not just of technological breakthroughs in Silicon Valley. I mean, Elon Musk is, justifiably lauded for these great achievements he's had in technology, but also in life sciences.
Yeah.
Vaccine production,
Sure.
breakthroughs in cancer and Alzheimer's.
And
all
all
of
that
this
is
is going to
being,
go.
all that is being challenged by
Well, yes, exactly.
getting rid of experts.
The 9 million grants that are under question at Harvard, they're all in the life sciences.
Yeah.
They're not to the humanities. They're not to people studying English, for example.
When do people wake up to the fact that this is a disaster for this country?
They don't wake up to the fact usually until it actually affects them directly,
Right.
which, of course, we've seen in every other setting as well. And by that time, it's too late. So, I mean, I think, the message that I and other people have been trying to say for some time is look at the facts, look at what's happening, look at previous history, and you know that you have to be pushed back collectively.
Just on Russia, I mean, what has he actually achieved in terms of Russia? Because there's no ceasefire. The Russians are, they're launching their spring offensive as we speak. Putin's, is kind of firmly in power. Okay, the economy's in a bit of trouble, but it's a war economy now. Ukraine is struggling. They're constantly hanging under this cloud. What are the Americans going to do next? What has all that bluster about Russia achieved so far?
I think in the way that you're asking the question, bluster about Russia and all about Russia, it is all about Russia. Trump wants to reset the Russian-US relationship. It's what he wanted to do the first term.
Because he admires Vladimir Putin as an autocrat?
But he also, again, go back to the 1980s, his visit to Moscow. He thinks that Russia and the Soviet Union, by the way, are just the same thing, just to be very clear. So the fact that Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Kazakhstan, you name it, we're all part of the Soviet Union, is irrelevant to Trump. When he talks about Russian deaths in World War II, these are Soviet deaths. And Ukraine at that point lost about 20%, maybe even 25% of its population. It was the killing fields of World War II. And so, but for Trump, it's all about Russia. It's the Soviet Union, it's the superpower. His first visit to Moscow in that period, he was wined and dined. He immediately started writing and being interviewed about the trajectory of US-Soviet, US-Russian relations, talking about the importance of setting that relationship on a different path then, for all kinds of deals and, economic cooperation and security cooperation. He's still on that tack. That's what he wants. He wants to go back to the unfulfilled promise of his, the golden period of his youth when he is, in his 40s and rising up, to kind of the top as a celebrity world figure and business person. And Ukraine is in the way. It's completely in the way, and he's very...
Because Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be in... I mean, they don't want Ukraine to be an independent nation.
He doesn't want the war to be there. He said it wouldn't have happened if he was in place. He wants it out of the way. It's not his war right from the beginning. He said that's other people. He wants to just get down like you and I sitting here and talk to Vladimir Putin and make, the kind of the world a safer place as he, deals with nuclear weapons. And they have, they go back to Reagan and Gorbachev and the nuclear treaties, which, is not a bad thing. But it's
the
completely
politics of
discounting.
big men sitting across the table discussing stuff.
And it's discounting, however, all of the other problems that are out there. And it's almost as if it's in a vacuum. It's like we've all been stuck in aspic, like one of those jellied, horrible things that, back in our youth we might have got served for tea by our grannies, one of these jelly things with a piece of meat in the middle of it. And that's kind of, we've been stuck in that kind of 1980s aspic. For Trump's point of view. But look, I really think it comes down to the fact that he absolutely and utterly wants, as a life goal, to reset the US-Russia relationship and see it through. And he also is of the view that, look, if everybody makes money out of this, everybody gets rich, what's to complain about?
So that is really bad news for Ukraine, isn't it?
It's terrible news for Ukraine, it's terrible news for Europe, and it's terrible news actually for anybody watching this and wondering, what that is going to have in terms of reverberations, elsewhere. There's all that sense of aggrandizement. I never pegged him for being an imperialist the first time around, but I hadn't made the logical conclusion, from if you develop real estate that, you then want to go further. And that's Greenland, that's Canada, that's Panama. I mean, probably maybe...
I was going to ask you about that. This is new, isn't it? But is this, certainly new in my mind, because I hadn't noticed it before. Does he think in these hemispheric kind of neighborhood terms? My global neighborhood is the Americas, just like, it was Queens and Brooklyn, and Lower Manhattan. This is now my neighborhood, and therefore I want Greenland, because it's good for security. I want the Panama Canal. I want Canada, and Mexico can be a sort of, factory state for us. Is that what it is?
I think it really, that's a pretty good assessment. And look, Trump, is always pretty straightforward in the way he describes things. He's very public. I mean, I think you can take him at his word on this. Vladimir Putin's certainly taking him at his word. Vladimir Putin has recently made a speech, he was talking about the Arctic, and he starts talking about the validity of US claims.
Yeah.
There is no validity to US claims. It's just that it is true that historically the US has made claims against both Canada and Greenland, and also Iceland, frankly, and other territories as well. So Putin's egging him on at this point because for Putin, that's fantastic. That means Putin can dominate not just Ukraine and the whole former Soviet bloc, but Europe as well, because Russia will be the big kid on the block, especially if Putin and Trump's vision of a Europe without the EU or a Europe with a very diluted NATO, if it's still there. I mean, neither Trump nor Putin are particularly keen on NATO for a whole variety of different, but sometimes similar kinds of reasons. Europe is really in the crosshairs here too.
You said earlier that he doesn't like wars. He doesn't like to see, beautiful young men die and all that stuff that he's been going on about. But is there a danger? Do you think there is a danger that all these things could actually lead to a proper shooting war, either because of some mishap and, hurt pride issue with the Russians, or maybe with the Chinese? Often trade wars morph into real wars. How and what kind of danger are we that this will actually become?
We're already in a situation where you could describe this as World War III, structurally. I mean, everybody thinks about that and they immediately think nuclear war, nuclear Armageddon, and Trump told Zelensky, look, you're gambling with World War III here, because again, he wants Zelensky to just put up, shut up, and go away so we can get back to negotiating with Putin. But we've got a hot war in Europe at this very moment that's had around 1 million casualties in terms of people either
huge.
killed or severely wounded, millions of refugees, and all kinds of knock-on effects. That's very similar to what happened in World War I and World War II. Obviously, the scale is different, but they were system-changing conflicts. And they were also multi-vector, loads of different countries involved in that. And again, we've got China, North Korea, and Iran, all supporting Russia, some more material ways than others, obviously. And a whole host of other countries are happily fueling this war. India's been selling arms to the Russians. Iran's been building drone factories. North Korea's been sending troops, and now we hear that some Chinese troops, a limited number.
So there is an axis of sorts.
The Chinese government, probably didn't, necessarily send them there, but they got recruited and they haven't, gone back. But then again, lots of people are going to fight, foreign legion-like in Russia itself. I mean, that's what happened in the Spanish Civil War. It's happened in all kinds of wars. But then we've got conflicts all the way around the world. We've got conflicts in the Middle East. We've got conflicts in Africa. We've got all kinds of upheavals in which enormous numbers of people are dying and nothing is being done. So the United States is also taking itself out of the game. So we're not going to stop any of these conflicts either, including, frankly, in the Middle East.
Trying to wrap it all up, and there's an awful lot to wrap up here. I mean, with everything that he's doing, both on the global stage and at home, do you think that the Republic is in danger of disappearing? Genuinely, that, you know, that even if someone else becomes president, a Democrat, I don't know, or a nice Republican who's not like Trump, I mean, a Republican who doesn't have the same ideals, that America can survive the way that we used to know it, or is it finished?
America's never finished, and I mean, nowhere's ever finished. I mean, no state collapses completely and, you know, completely disappears. We could say, there's been the partition of this, that, and the other, but there's always something still there, the memory of it, or, you know, some kind of, you know, historic residue that people will, you know, say has had impacts on other things. But look, I think America has been grievously wounded, and has been heading in this path for a very long time, to be honest. It's the fetishization of the presidency, for one thing.
Yeah.
The president was never supposed to be above everything. And, you know, steadily through successive presidents, frankly,
yes.
Including some of the presidents that, you know, I've worked for previously, George W. Bush, absolutely, Obama as well, frankly, because they all started doing everything by executive order. And trying to bypass Congress because it was deeply frustrating. They've all contributed to the kind of path we're on now, where Trump believes that the presidency is basically the only institution that counts. And, you know, we approach the 250th anniversary of America and the casting off of Britain and, you know, King George and the sort of the tyranny of the empire. America's looking remarkably like, you know, kind of a Great Britain of 250 years ago, complete with a king, which Trump wants to be.
How ironic that in the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution against the British monarchy, we've got someone in the White House who's behaving very much like a wannabe monarch. Fiona Hill, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. That's it with Fiona Hill from this special edition of the Fourcast from Washington, D.C.